Welcome. Close your eyes when you're ready and let the stillness settle over you. Far from the day, we'll drift toward a quiet river in Mississippi where something strange once settled over the night. If this brings you rest, subscribe, and there'll be a new one waiting tomorrow night. The Pascagoula River moves south on an October night, wide and dark, carrying the faint industrial light of the city it passes through on its way toward the Gulf of Mexico. The water is not fast here. It is not slow either. It moves with the particular unhurried consistency of a river that has been traveling the same route for a very long time and has no particular need to arrive quickly, draining a basin of roughly 9,000 square miles southward through the flat coastal terrain of southeastern Mississippi before releasing itself into the Gulf near the city that shares its name. The surface carries reflections, not natural ones, not the moon or the stars alone, but the low amber glow of the Ingalls shipbuilding yard a mile or so distant, the occasional light of a vessel or a shore installation, the soft blurred geometry of an industrial waterfront seen from the water's own level. Nothing about the river on this particular October evening in 1973 announces itself as unusual. It is a working river beside a working city, and both are going quietly about their ordinary business as the light fails. 80 miles. That is the length of the main channel of the Pascagoula, 80 miles from the confluence of the Leaf and Chickasaw rivers, where the two tributaries meet near Merrill, Mississippi, and become one southward moving body of water, to the Gulf of Mexico, where that joined current finally opens and disperses into something larger than itself. The basin it drains is not small. 9,000 square miles of southeastern Mississippi moves its water through this system. Rainfall and runoff gathered from pine forests and agricultural flatlands and the outer edges of small towns, all of it eventually finding its way into this single southward channel. The Pascagoula is among the largest unimpounded river systems in the contiguous United States, meaning no major dams interrupt its flow, and the river moves as it has always moved, freely, continuously, in one uninterrupted southward direction from the hill country to the coast. That distinction, the lack of impoundment, gives the river a quality that is increasingly uncommon. It runs without interruption. It has not been divided, or redirected, or made to hold still. The confluence near Merrill, where the Leaf and the Chickasaw rivers meet and become the Pascagoula, is a place worth pausing at. Two moving bodies of water, each with its own separate character and its own drainage basin, arriving from slightly different directions at a common point and joining. The joining is not violent. There is no cascade, no sudden drop. The two currents meet at a widening angle and the merged flow settles, the combined volume steadying as it turns to align itself southward. The river that leaves this meeting point is wider than either of the rivers that made it, and quieter in a certain way. The turbulence of the merger smoothed out within a few hundred yards by the simple physics of moving water finding its level. From Merrill southward, the river carries everything both its tributaries carried and moves it steadily toward the coast, through the flat terrain of Jackson County, past the small communities and the industrial waterfront of Pascagoula, and then into the Gulf. The west bank of the river near the city, bears the particular character of a working waterfront, not a natural shoreline of mud and vegetation, but a constructed one, a place where industrial activity has met the river's edge and imposed its own geometry. Concrete and compressed fill replace the natural bank in stretches. Old structures stand at the water's margin, some of them still in use, some of them abandoned, and standing in the particular stillness of things that served a purpose, and now wait without any clear expectation of serving it again. One of those structures, a grain elevator, no longer in active use by the autumn of 1973, stands along the bank near Schaupeter Road, where an informal fishing spot has developed over the years at the flat edge where the concrete meets the water. The bank here is level. The water is accessible without a steep descent or an unstable footing. The light from the nearest inhabited structures is distant enough that the water at this section of the bank sits largely in shadow after dark, the river surface dark and moving, the grain elevator's bulk standing behind anyone who chooses to stand or sit at the water's edge. This is a known spot, not official, not designated, not marked on any recreational map of the area. Known in the way that fishing spots are known, passed between colleagues, mentioned in casual conversation. Remembered because someone caught something there, once, or found the bank comfortable, or simply discovered that the current at that particular bend tends to hold the kinds of fish worth waiting for. The stretch of bank near the old grain elevator on Schaupeter Road is the kind of place people come to on evenings when the weather cooperates and there is nothing more pressing to do. A place defined not by any scenic quality, but by its usefulness for a particular kind of quiet activity, pursued in a particular kind of quiet company. The concrete is flat. The river is close. The old structure behind the bank blocks the wind from one direction. It is a practical place for what people use it for, and nothing about it is remarkable. The night of October 11th, 1973, falls on the Gulf Coast with the characteristic mildness of early autumn in that part of the world. The days have begun to shorten. The most intense heat of the Mississippi summer has long since passed, and what remains in the first weeks of October is something more temperate and easier to inhabit, evenings that are still warm enough to be comfortable outdoors, with a humidity that has dropped from its summer peak to something merely present rather than oppressive. No weather event of any significance has been recorded or reported in the area on this date. No rain, no unusual winds, no front moving through to disturb the air or the water. The conditions are what they appear to be, a calm early autumn evening on the Gulf Coast, the kind of evening that arrives regularly in this part of Mississippi and is accepted without particular comment by the people who live there. The air sits mild and humid over the river. The water surface moves south beneath it, dark and untroubled. The grain elevator stands still. It is useful to understand the character of the city that sits beside this river in October 1973, because the character of a city shapes the people it makes, and the lives they live, and the context in which any event that happens there must be understood. Pascagoula in 1973 is not a large city. It is not a city whose residents have occasion to see their home mentioned frequently in national news, or to feel themselves as anything other than the working inhabitants of a working Gulf Coast town. What defines Pascagoula's economy and its identity in this period is the Ingalls shipbuilding facility, the large sprawling yard along the waterfront that in 1973 is one of the most productive shipbuilding operations in the United States, engaged in defense contracts for the U.S. Navy, constructing vessels of the kind that require enormous capital infrastructure, skilled labor, and years-long production cycles. The cranes along the waterfront are visible from considerable distances across the flat coastal terrain. The sound of metalwork carries across the water on the right kind of evening. At shift change, the yard generates its own particular movement, workers arriving and departing, the rhythms of large-scale industrial labor operating on its own internal clock. This is the employment that shapes Pascagoula in the early 1970s, and through employment shapes its population. The city draws workers, people who come for the steady industrial work that a facility of Ingalls' scale can provide, who settle into the community around that work, who build their lives within the particular framework of a place defined by blue-collar pride, practical competence, and the kind of community identity that forms around shared labor rather than around institutions of education or culture. Pascagoula is a city of people who make things, who know how things are made, who measure competence in practical terms, and hold in respect the kinds of knowledge that produce useful results. It is also, in the way of many southern Mississippi communities of this period, a place with deep roots in a regional identity that values self-sufficiency and views outside scrutiny with a settled skepticism, not hostility precisely, but the particular wariness of communities that have learned to expect that attention from elsewhere tends to arrive with its own agenda already formed. The year 1973 in the United States carries a specific atmosphere that is worth holding alongside the local character of Pascagoula. The country is not, in 1973, in a period of settled institutional trust. The Nixon administration is entering the final stage of the Watergate crisis, a slow-motion collapse of public confidence in federal institutions that has been building through the preceding year and will reach its culmination in 1974. The hearings and investigations and revelations of this period have produced, across American communities of every political character, a generalized lowering of trust in official accounts and official conclusions. This is not a partisan observation. The atmosphere of institutional skepticism in 1973 runs through the country at a level that affects how people receive official statements, how they evaluate claims made by government bodies, and how they assess the reliability of information that comes to them through institutional channels. In a working-class Mississippi city in the autumn of that year, this atmosphere is present, not loudly, not as a topic of daily conversation, but as a background condition affecting how people in Pascagoula orient themselves toward official versions of events. It is also worth noting, in describing the city of Pascagoula in October 1973, what the city is not. It is not a city with a history of extraordinary claims or documented incidents of the kind that tend to put places on certain kinds of maps. It is not a city whose residents have particular reason to expect unusual events or to have developed any collective framework for receiving them. The grain elevator on the west bank of the river is an ordinary abandoned industrial structure. The stretch of concrete bank near Schaupeter Road is an ordinary informal fishing spot. The river moving south past it is an ordinary river, wide and dark, flowing as it has flowed through every previous October on its way to the Gulf. The city beside it is a city of ordinary working lives, going about their ordinary business on a mild October evening. The conditions for an extraordinary event, in other words, are the absence of all such conditions, the flat plainness of a place and a night that have given no advance indication of being anything other than what they appear. The Ingalls shipbuilding yard seen from across the water at shift change carries its own particular quality. The cranes and the hull structures catch the late afternoon light along the waterfront. The geometry of large-scale naval construction, the angular forms of partially completed vessels against the flat horizon of the Mississippi Gulf Coast. The sounds of metalwork carry. The movement of workers arriving and departing creates a low-level human activity at the water's edge, and then the shift turns over and the evening settles, and the sounds diminish as the light fades. What the yard looks like from a distance in the early evening of an autumn day in 1973 is a working waterfront in a working city going quiet at the end of a working day, not picturesque, not grim, simply present in the particular way that large industrial infrastructure is present when it is doing what it was built to do, and you are accustomed to seeing it do it. The cranes stand in their places along the skyline. The hull forms sit in the water or on the ways. The yard goes quiet as the shift ends, and the river moves south past it in the dark. Move upstream from the city, move northward up the main channel, away from the shipyard and the industrial waterfront, past the quieter stretches of the lower river, and back through the terrain it has drained on its way to the coast. The Pascagoula Gulls Basin is a landscape of pine flatlands and wetland margins, and the gradual upslope of the Mississippi interior. The river feeds from a system of tributaries that gather water from this varied terrain: the Chickasaw Way, coming in from the northeast, the Leaf from the northwest, and between them collecting the rainfall of thousands of square miles of southeastern Mississippi. The land through which this water moves is not dramatic land. It is the quiet, flat, pine-covered terrain of the Gulf coastal plain, a landscape defined more by its horizontal extent than by any vertical feature, more by its water than by its stone, more by the continuous movement of things through it than by any fixed and notable form. The river is part of this. It does not announce itself. It simply moves, southward as it has always moved, carrying what comes to it from the land it drains. The confluence of the Leaf and the Chickasaw Way at Merrill deserves a second look, not because it is a dramatic place, but because it is the specific place where the Pascagoula begins. Two rivers arrive from different directions. The Chickasaw Way is the longer of the two, rising in the hill country to the northeast and traveling a considerable distance before reaching the junction. The Leaf rises to the northwest and runs roughly parallel before curving to meet its companion at Merrill. They carry different water, different drainage basins, different histories of rainfall and ground absorption, different mineral loads from the soils they have moved through. At the confluence, the two currents enter the same channel and become, by the simple fact of occupying the same banks, one river. The joined body of water widens as it turns south. The turbulence of the meeting point settles within a few hundred yards. By the time the new combined current has moved any real distance southward, the evidence of the joining is gone. The river runs as a single thing, carrying the combined volume of both tributaries steadily toward the coast, with no visible seam between what was the Chickasaw Hay and what was the Leaf. The river that arrives at Pascagoula is one river. The grain elevator on the west bank near Shalpeter Road is the kind of structure that accumulates its own quiet history without any particular intention to do so. Industrial buildings of this type, built for a specific practical purpose, used for a period, then vacated when the purpose shifts or the economics change, take on a settled, permanent quality over the years of their disuse that is different from the quality of active structures. They stand. They weather. They become part of the landscape in a more absolute way than active buildings do, because active buildings are understood to be temporary in the sense that their use will eventually change, while abandoned structures have already reached their final state and are simply occupying it for however long it takes for the structure to give way. The grain elevator near Shalpeter Road stands dark against the October sky. The concrete bank in front of it meets the river at its flat level, and the water moves past it moving south, the same water that has moved past this stretch of bank through every previous autumn since the structure was built, indifferent to whatever the structure is or was. An early autumn Gulf Coast evening has a particular quality of light as it settles. The sky over the Mississippi Gulf Coast in October holds light longer than northern latitudes do at the same season, the line between civil twilight and full dark extending over a longer period. The sky moving through a gradual sequence of gradients, rather than dropping suddenly from day to night. By the time full dark arrives, the air has cooled only marginally from its daytime temperature. The humidity remains, not heavy, not uncomfortable in the way of the deepest summer months, but present, the particular soft moisture of a coastal atmosphere that never entirely loses the smell of the nearby water. The river at the concrete bank near the grain elevator is largely invisible once the sky has darkened completely, audible rather than visible. The sound of moving water against a flat bank carrying across the otherwise quiet industrial margin of the west shore. The grain elevator, already dark by the time the last daylight has gone, becomes a shape rather than a structure, a bulk, a presence, something known to be there without being clearly seen. The Gulf of Mexico lies 80 miles south of this bank, at the end of the river's travel. The Pascagoula empties near the city that shares its name, the current spreading and slowing as it enters the shallow coastal margin of the Gulf, the river's character changing as the fresh water meets the salt. The Gulf Coast of Mississippi in October is a particular kind of place, flat, wide, open to the sky in all directions, the horizon unobstructed by any significant elevation. The sea itself is calm at this time of year under normal conditions, the hurricane season nearing its end. The water's still warm from the summer months, but the air beginning to carry the first suggestion of the longer cooling that will deepen through the winter. 80 miles north of that coastline, on the river that will carry everything from this particular stretch of bank down to the sea. The water moves south in the dark, past the concrete of the informal fishing spot near the old grain elevator on Chowper Road, past the distant lights of the Ingalls Yard, past the quieter margins of the lower river where the bank becomes less industrial and more natural, and eventually past the city's edge and into the coastal plain and then into the Gulf. There is a quality to October evenings in this part of Mississippi that residents of the Gulf Coast will recognize, and that people from other regions occasionally find surprising. The fall does not arrive here with the same announcement that it makes in higher latitudes or more elevated terrain. There is no sudden cool snap, no dramatic color change in the vegetation, no sharp transition from one season to another. What happens is subtler, a gradual relaxation of the heat, a slow decrease in the oppressive density of the midsummer humidity, an incremental lengthening of the comfortable parts of the day. By October, the evenings are pleasant in a way that July evenings are not, warm enough to be outdoors without effort, cool enough to be comfortable over a longer period of sitting still. A person at a riverbank on an October evening in southeastern Mississippi is, in terms of physical comfort, in one of the better conditions the year has to offer. The air is mild, the river is close. The sounds are mostly the river and the occasional distant indication of the city going about its evening business. The city of Pascagoula in 1973 does not see itself as a place where extraordinary events occur. This is not a statement about anything specific that has or has not happened there. It is a statement about a community's working self-image, the way a place composed primarily of working people engaged in large-scale industrial labor tends to understand itself as a practical and grounded environment, oriented toward the tangible and the functional. The workers at Ingalls build ships. They know the specifications of what they build. They know what steel behaves like under different conditions, what tolerance levels matter, and why, what the difference is between what an engineer has drawn and what a physical structure will bear. The culture of a shipbuilding city is in many ways a culture of exacting practical knowledge held in working hands, and the people who carry that culture tend to orient themselves toward concrete reality in a particular way. They are not, as a rule, people who spend their evenings generating dramatic stories for external audiences. The river moves past the west bank of Pascagoula in October 1973, and the city beside it is simply living its ordinary life, as it does on every other ordinary evening of this or any other year. The sky over the Pascagoula River on the night of October 11th, 1973, is clear. Both men who spent that evening on the concrete bank near the old grain elevator would later describe the conditions as they found them: clear, calm, the kind of mild October night that invites an evening at the water. No rain had fallen, no significant wind was moving. The atmospheric conditions were by all accounts as unremarkable as the location and the evening and the year that contained them. The river moved south, as it always moves south. The grain elevator stood dark behind the bank. The nearest lights were distant enough to leave the water largely in shadow. The air was mild and humid, carrying the low coastal warmth of a Gulf evening in early autumn, and the sound of the river against the flat concrete bank was soft and continuous and indifferent to anything happening at its edge. Two men settled on that bank with their fishing lines in the water. They had come from the industrial work of the day, from the rhythms and practical demands of Pascagoula's shipbuilding economy, and they had come here to this informal and familiar stretch of riverbank for the particular kind of companionable quiet that a fishing evening provides. The lines went into the current. The river accepted them without comment and moved south with them, trailing in the dark water. The grain elevator stood still behind the men. The October night settled over the river and the bank and the old industrial structure and the two figures sitting at the water's edge. The air was mild. The water was audible, barely, against the concrete. Nothing about the night announced itself as anything other than what it appeared to be: an ordinary evening on a familiar stretch of a southern river. The two men in it, quiet and at ease, the current moving south below their lines in the dark. The Pascagoula River, on an October night, carries the specific quality of a place that has been here a long time and expects to be here a long time more. The water that passes any fixed point on its west bank has come from far inland, from the confluence at Merrill, from the drainage of the Chickasaw and the Leaf, from the pine flatlands and the wetland margins of 9,000 square miles of southeastern Mississippi, and will, within hours, join the Gulf of Mexico and disperse into something larger than any river name can hold. The bank near the grain elevator on Chalpeter Road is simply one point along this continuous movement, one fixed position beside a flow that has no awareness of the positions it passes. The concrete is flat. The water is close. The men sit at the edge of the bank with their lines in the current, and the October night is quiet around them, and the river moves south, as rivers do, without any intention of stopping. Charles Hickson was 42 years old on the night of October 11th, 1973. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent his working life inside a shipyard, calloused along the palms in the way that comes not from a single day of hard work, but from years of it, the kind of durable physical competence that accumulates slowly and shows in the way a man moves through a workspace, the way he handles tools without looking at them, the way he gives an instruction once and is understood. He was a foreman at Ingalls Shipbuilding in Pascagoula, Mississippi, which in 1973 was one of the largest and most productive naval shipyards in the United States. That position meant something in a city built around that yard. It meant he had earned the trust of the people above him and the people working under him in equal measure over a long period of time. In Pascagoula, a foreman at Ingalls was not an anonymous figure. The yard employed thousands of workers. It built vessels for the United States Navy. Its cranes were visible from the waterfront. Its shift changes altered the rhythm of the surrounding streets, and its identity as the economic spine of the city meant that the men who held supervisory positions there were known quantities in their communities. People with standing, with histories, with neighbors who could attest to who they were over many years. Hickson was a father. He had deep roots in Mississippi. He had not come to Pascagoula as a newcomer looking to establish himself. He had been there, working, living, building a life in the way that people do when a place is genuinely their home. None of this is incidental to what happened later. It is in fact one of the first things investigators and researchers noted when they began trying to understand who these two men were, that Hickson was precisely the sort of person whose account was difficult to dismiss on the basis of character alone. Calvin Parker was 19. That is a considerable gap, 23 years between the two of them, nearly a full generation, and it meant that on the night of October 11th, Parker was still at the beginning of whatever his life in Pascagoula was going to be. He had come from Laurel, Mississippi, a town roughly 100 miles to the north, and had relocated to take up industrial work in a city that was, in 1973, drawing young men from across the region into its labor economy. The shipyard, the industries connected to it, the general hum of a working port city, these were the things that brought people south. Parker was one of them. He was new enough to the city that the riverbank on Chowpeter Road may not yet have accumulated the quiet familiarity it had for Hickson, but he had found his way there through the older man, through the ordinary social architecture of co-workers who share an interest and share a Thursday evening. The fishing trip on October 11th was not a ceremony or a ritual or a specially arranged occasion. It was the kind of thing that happens between colleagues when the weather is mild and neither one has pressing reason to be elsewhere. Hickson and Parker knew each other through work. Their connection was the kind that forms in industrial settings, grounded in shared physical labor, in the particular ease of men who understand each other's competence, in the low-key trust that develops when someone has worked alongside you through long shifts without incident. There was nothing remarkable about their being on the riverbank together that evening. Researchers would later note this detail as one of the quiet elements that worked against any interpretation of the event as staged or premeditated. If the two of them had planned something theatrical, they had chosen an odd way to do it, an unannounced fishing trip on a weeknight, at an informal spot along a concrete industrial bank, with no audience and no warning to anyone that something notable was about to happen. The evening had the texture of an ordinary one, right up to the moment it did not. In the immediate aftermath, at the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, in the late hours of that same night, the difference between the two men was visible and noted by everyone who saw them. Hickson spoke. He was not calm. No one who encountered him that evening described him as calm, but he was verbal, effortful, engaged in the hard work of trying to communicate something for which he did not have adequate words. He told what had happened in the only way he could, which was sequentially, with the particular determination of a man who needs to be believed and knows it. He was 42 and a foreman and accustomed to being heard. Whatever had happened on the riverbank, he was not going to let it pass without record. Parker was another matter. Officers at the sheriff's office that night noted his condition with a consistency that has been referenced across decades of case documentation. He was weeping. He was trembling. He showed what investigators and researchers would later describe as signs of acute psychological fragmentation, not the vague distress of someone who has had a fright and recovered, but the particular, unmistakable presentation of a person in a state of genuine shock. He was 19 years old and new to the city and sitting in a chair in an institutional room in the small hours of October 12th, and the officers watching him described what they saw as behavior inconsistent with deliberate fabrication. A person performing distress for an audience has tells us the performance is calibrated, even slightly, toward the audience. What the officers at the sheriff's office noted in Parker was not calibrated. It was not aimed at anyone. It was simply present. The question of character evidence is a contested one in the literature around cases like this. A man standing in his community, his history of reliability, his apparent lack of motive for deception. These things do not prove an account is true, but they do change what an investigator is dealing with. When Hickson presented himself at the sheriff's office on the night of October 11th, the officers there were not sitting across from a marginal figure or a known eccentric. They were sitting across from a 42-year-old shipyard foreman with roots in their community, accompanied by a 19-year-old colleague who was visibly in pieces. Whatever conclusion those officers would eventually reach, they were not able to reach it quickly or easily because the two men in front of them did not fit the profile of people for whom false reporting was a natural or obvious behavior. Hickson carried the case publicly for a long time. He carried it in the way that some people carry things, not compulsively, not as performance, but with the steady, slightly weary commitment of someone who has decided that a thing is real and that the responsibility for saying so rests with them. He gave interviews across the years following the incident. He appeared at conferences and events connected to UAP research. He spoke to journalists, to investigators, to researchers who arrived with notebooks and recorders and sets of careful questions. Across all of it, across nearly 4 decades of this kind of public engagement, the core elements of what he described on the night of October 11th did not change in any substantial way. The shape of the account remained consistent. The details that had been unusual, and some of them were very unusual, were still there in the same positions, described in the same terms, years and then decades later. In 1983, a decade after the incident, Hickson co-authored a book with journalist William Mendez. It was called UFO Contact at Pascagoula. A decade is a long time to sit with a story before putting it into print. It is long enough for the urgent, raw quality of a fresh account to settle into something more considered, more shaped, more aware of its own place in a larger conversation. The book represented Hickson's sustained engagement with what had happened, not the panicked, effortful account of a man in a sheriff's office at midnight, but the organized, committed version of a man who had spent 10 years living with a memory and trying to make sense of it. Whatever the reader's interpretation of the events at the riverbank, the book is the record of that decade's passage. It exists. It sits on shelves with his name on the spine. It is one of the things that remains. There is a particular consistency worth noting about a person who tells the same story across 4 decades. The usual patterns of memory suggest the opposite, that accounts change over time, that details shift and accumulate, and occasionally contradict earlier versions, that the mind revises its own records in ways the person doing the remembering may not even notice. Hickson's account did not follow that pattern. Researchers who compared his early statements to his later interviews found the core elements undisturbed. This is noted not as proof of anything, but as an observation about the texture of the account itself, that whatever Hickson was describing, he appeared to be describing the same thing each time he described it. Calvin Parker's silence was of an entirely different quality. After the immediate, unavoidable public exposure of the incident in October 1973, Parker largely withdrew from the subject. He did not cultivate a public profile around the case. He did not give the kind of sustained media attention that Hickson gave. For the better part of 4 decades, he occupied something closer to the position of a man who had decided, or perhaps been forced by necessity, that the story was one he did not need to keep telling. He lived. He got older. The 19-year-old from Laurel, who had been sitting on a concrete riverbank, became a man in his 20s, his 30s, his 40s, his 50s, and the story of October 11th, 1973, was still there in the background of his life, without being, at least publicly, its defining feature. This kind of long silence is worth holding for a moment without rushing past it. Silence about an event is not the same as forgetting it. The 2 men who were present on the Pascagoula River bank on the night of October 11th occupied their silence and their speech very differently, and neither the speaking nor the silence resolves anything about what actually happened. What it does illuminate is something about the different ways people carry events that have no comfortable place in ordinary life. Hickson moved his through speech, through print, through the sustained effort of public accounting. Parker moved his through something quieter, something internal, something that did not surface in any sustained public way for an extraordinarily long time. In 2018, 45 years after the October evening on the Pascagoula River bank, Calvin Parker published a book. He was 64 years old. He co-wrote it with a researcher named Irina Scott, and its title was Pascagoula, The Closest Encounter. 45 years is a particular kind of span. The 19-year-old who had sat trembling in a chair at the Jackson County Sheriff's Office in the small hours of October 12, 1973, had lived nearly a complete adult life before putting the account into print under his own name. The book was not simply a repetition of what had been documented in the immediate aftermath of the incident. It contained material that Parker had not previously disclosed publicly, details that had remained private for 4.5 decades, held inside the account as he carried it through the years without releasing it. Among the things Parker disclosed in the 2018 book was his recollection, fragmentary and incomplete by his own description, of an entity inside the craft that appeared to him as more feminine in character than the 3 figures that had been described from the riverbank. This detail had not appeared in the 1973 accounts. It had not been part of the public record of the case in any form that researchers had access to across those decades. The fact of its disclosure, 45 years later, in the voice of a man who had been largely silent about the case for most of that time, introduced a layer of complexity into the record that could not easily be accounted for by any simple framework, not by the framework that dismissed the incident entirely, and not by the framework that accepted the account as complete. What was consistent across the distance between 1973 and 2018 was the shape of the core account. What Parker described in his book aligned with the fundamental sequence of events that Hickson had described in his statements, his interviews, and his 1983 book. The 2 accounts had taken different routes across 4.5 decades and arrived at the same underlying structure. Researchers who worked with both accounts after 2018 noted this consistency without resolving it. It remained what it had always been, a feature of the record, not an answer. There is something in the particular figure of Parker in 2018 that holds attention for a moment. He was 64. He had the voice by then of a man who had lived long enough with something that it no longer needed defending in any urgent or anxious way. He was not 19 and weeping in an institutional chair. He was not trying to convince anyone of anything in the way that a young person, raw from a disorienting event, tries to convince. He was simply speaking, in the measured way of someone who has carried a story for a very long time and has decided at last that it is ready to be spoken aloud in full. The 45 years had not changed what he remembered. They had perhaps changed only his relationship to the telling of it. Charles Hickson worked in a shipyard for years. He was a foreman. He spent his days in an environment built around precision and reliability, where instructions followed meant vessels were built correctly, where a man's judgment about materials and methods had to be trusted because the alternative was costly or dangerous. The professional world he occupied was one in which consistency and accuracy were baseline expectations, not exceptional qualities. This does not prove anything about what happened on a riverbank in October 1973, but it is part of who he was, part of the texture of his life before the night became the thing people asked him about. He had been a foreman before October 11th. He remained a foreman after it. The identity he had built through years of work did not dissolve into the event, even though the event became the thing most people who did not know him personally would eventually associate with his name. Parker was a young man new to a city, finding his footing. He was not yet the person he would become over the next 45 years. He was in the early stages of becoming whoever that was going to be. The night of October 11th found him at a particular moment of openness and incompleteness. At 19, when a person is still largely unformed in the way that matters, still assembling the sense of what the world is and what to do with it. Whatever the night on the riverbank was, it arrived before he had acquired the long experience of managing the unexpected that comes with decades of living. His distress at the sheriff's office was, at least in part, the distress of someone who has not yet built up the particular scar tissue that comes from surviving surprising things. He was 19. He had just arrived in Pascagoula. The world had not yet taught him what to do when it did something he had no category for. The two men are often discussed as a unit, Hickson and Parker, the Pascagoula witnesses, in the way that unusual events tend to collapse the individuality of the people who experience them into a shared designation. But they were not interchangeable, and the case is not the same case when seen through each of them separately. Hickson's story runs forward from October 11th, 1973, through decades of public speech, through the 1983 book, through hundreds of interviews, through conference appearances and documentary segments, until his death in September of 2011. Parker's story runs forward from that same night, through a long, largely private passage, through the accumulation of an adult life held mostly apart from the public record of the incident, until 2018, when the book arrived and the silence ended. Two different arcs, two different relationships to the same night. Held together, they make a particular kind of portrait of two people who came to a concrete riverbank on a mild October evening and went away from it, carrying something that each of them managed in entirely their own way. There is no framework within the documented record that makes sense of both arcs simultaneously in a way that leaves no remainder. The man who spent 4 decades speaking about the event with consistent detail, and the man who spent 4 decades not speaking about it and then disclosed details the first man had never mentioned, together they produce a record that resists the usual simplifications. Not because the simplifications are lazy, exactly, but because the record does not cooperate with them. The record is two lives, moving through time, carrying the same night between them in different ways, and then eventually producing accounts that align with each other at the core, while diverging at the edges in ways that are genuinely interesting. Charles Hickson, the foreman at Ingalls Shipbuilding, the man with calloused hands and a long history of being trusted by the people he worked alongside, did not change his account across the decades he spent telling it. He did not, in any documented instance, retract what he had said. He did not, in any recorded conversation or published statement, suggest that what he had experienced was something other than what he had described at the Jackson County Sheriff's Office in the middle of the night on October 11th, 1973. He carried it forward, and he set it down in a book, and he continued to carry it after the book, and he was still carrying it when he died at 80 years old in September 2011. Whatever it was his for the rest of his life, and he made no sign of wanting to be free of it in the way that would require saying it had been something other than what it was. Parker's 2018 book sits differently in the record. It is a later object. It arrived after nearly half a century of silence and carries the weight of that duration, the sense of something long held and finally released, a closed container opened after a very long time. The details in it that had not appeared in the 1973 accounts raise questions that the 2018 publication itself does not resolve, and does not appear to be trying to resolve. Parker was not writing to close the case. He was writing, it seems, because the time had come to write, because 45 years had passed, and the account was still there inside him, still intact, and the decision had been made at last to let it out in full. The book exists. It has his name on it. It carries details that were not part of the public record for 4.5 decades, and are now part of it, adding a layer to a case that had already been thoroughly documented, thoroughly debated, and nowhere near resolved. The 2018 publication did not resolve it further. It complicated it, gently in the way that new information added to an old record tends to do, not by contradicting what was there before, but by introducing something that was missing, something that changes the shape of what the record contains without changing the center of it. The 19-year-old who wept in a chair in the Jackson County Sheriff's Office and the 64-year-old who co-wrote a book about the same evening are the same person, which is not a statement about age alone, but about the way a single event can run through an entire life, from its beginning to its long middle, without diminishing in significance or clarity. Parker was younger than most people are when they have experiences they will carry for the rest of their lives. The event found him early. He carried it a long way. The particular quality of the 2018 book, 45 Years in the Making, carrying details held private for that entire span, is that it does not read, in the accounts of those who have reviewed it, as the work of someone constructing a narrative at a long remove from its source. It reads, by the description of researchers who engaged with it after publication, as the work of someone reporting what he remembered, with the particular clarity that some memories retain across great distances of time. The consistency with the core 1973 account is its most noted feature. Whatever the memory was made of, it had not degraded in the way that ordinary memories tend to degrade. It had simply waited, it seems, until Parker was ready to put it into words. Both men were working men in an industrial city on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi in October 1973. That is the simplest description of who they were, and it is in some ways the most important one. They were not people whose lives had equipped them with a particular framework for the kind of event they would later report. They had not spent years reading about UAP cases or attending to the literature of unexplained aerial phenomena. They had spent their years in the rhythms of industrial labor, in the specific physical world of a shipyard city, in the ordinary social life of working men in Mississippi in the early 1970s. Whatever framework they eventually developed for understanding what had happened to them on the riverbank, they did not arrive at the riverbank already holding it. They arrived as a 42-year-old foreman and a 19-year-old newcomer, with fishing lines and a mild October evening ahead of them, and nothing else. Calvin Parker's book was published in 2018. It is a physical object. It has pages and a spine, and his name printed on the cover. It can be held in a pair of hands. It took 45 years to exist, not in the sense that it was being written across all of that time, but in the sense that the person who had to write it needed 45 years of living before he was ready to do so. The account inside it, by all available documentation, is consistent with the one he gave on the night of October 11th, 1973, when he was 19 and new to Pascagoula, and sitting in a sheriff's office in a state of visible, unperformed distress. Some accounts, it turns out, take a very long time to be fully told. The book is there, the river was there first, and between the one and the other, two working men carried what they had been given, each in his own way, for all the years between. What reached them first was the sound. Not a sound the river made, and not a sound that carried the signature of anything moving along the bank or overhead in the ordinary way of things. What Hickson described in the account he gave at the sheriff's office that same night, and in the many accounts that followed across the years, was a humming or buzzing, low and present, arriving before there was anything visible to attach it to, filling the air above the flat concrete bank in a way that neither man had a word for at the time. It was not loud. It did not build toward anything theatrical. It arrived, and then it was there, and the October night around the two men on the west bank of the Pascagoula River became a different kind of night than the one they had been sitting in. Then the light appeared. Both men described it as bluish. Some accounts rendered it as blue-white, a particular cold luminescence, rather than the warmer ambient glow of an industrial waterfront or the distant lights of the city reflected off the river's surface. The light appeared on the bank and on the water. It cast itself across the concrete, across the dark surface of the river moving south beside them, across the industrial silhouette of the old grain elevator standing behind them in the dark. The Pascagoula River running below caught the color and held it for a moment in the way moving water holds any surface reflection, briefly broken by current, before passing it downstream and out of sight. The light did not flicker. According to the accounts both men gave, it was steady and it was close. The object producing it was oval or oblong in shape. That is what both Hickson and Parker described, and it is what Hickson repeated in formal interviews in the 1983 book he co-authored with journalist William Mendez, and in appearances across the decades that followed, an oval or oblong form, hovering a few feet above the ground rather than resting on the bank, emitting the blue-white light that had already altered the quality of the night before either man had moved from where he sat. The object produced no engine sound in the conventional sense, no combustion, no mechanical roar, no turbine note. What both men described hearing was the low humming that had come first, minimal, persistent, a sound that belonged to something operating rather than something merely present. These elements of the account, the shape, the light, the absence of conventional propulsive sound, the hovering proximity to the ground, were among the first details communicated to law enforcement on the night of October 11th, and they remained consistent across both witnesses' telling in the hours, months, and years that followed. The craft, as both men described it, was close enough to the bank that what happened next was immediate. 3 figures came from the object. Hickson and Parker described them as humanoid in their general outline, upright, roughly 5 feet in height, proportioned in a way that carried the broad shape of a person, while being nothing quite like a person on any closer examination. What the 2 men described was a surface texture that Hickson notably reached for an unusual word to convey: wrinkled pale gray, or grayish white, a texture he sometimes characterized as reminiscent of elephant hide, leathery and folded in a way that human skin is not. The skin, if skin was the right word for it, was the first thing that set the figures apart from any ready category. The faces were next. What both men described were features so rudimentary as to barely constitute a face in any recognizable sense, structures that occupied the area where a face would be arranged without providing the expected information, the expected readability that a human face carries even in profile and at a distance. There was no expression to read. There was no gaze to meet. The features were present in outline and absent in detail, a specific and unusual quality that Hickson described in terms of what was missing rather than what was there. And then there were the hands. What Hickson described in place of fingers was something else entirely. Appendages he characterized as claw-like, or as resembling the claws of a lobster, not grasping fingers, not a hand arranged in any way that mapped to the familiar structure of a hand. Something structured differently, built on a different model, reaching toward him on the concrete bank in the blue-white light, with a configuration that no convenient comparison quite served. This detail, the specific documented strangeness of those appendages, is one that Hickson returned to across decades of retellings without revision. It is also one of the details that researchers discussing the Pascagoula case have most consistently noted as a departure from the broadly circulating cultural templates of 1973. The figures of popular imagination at the time did not look like this. Whatever the origin of Hickson's description, it was not borrowed from the most available vocabulary. What happened to Hickson at the bank was described as a lifting or floating, not being physically carried in the way a person is carried, but moved, buoyed, translated from the bank into the craft in a way he could not fully account for in mechanical terms. He described a paralysis accompanying this movement, not the paralysis of fear, or not only that, but a stillness that had something imposed about it, a physical condition that removed from him the option of movement while leaving him fully conscious and fully aware of what was occurring around him. He was moved feet first through an opening in the craft. He described this sequence, the floating, the paralysis, the entry feet first, in consistent terms across multiple formal interviews and in the pages of his book, and the consistency of those particulars across a long span of years is a feature of the account that investigators and researchers have noted when attempting to evaluate what kind of account this is. Calvin Parker was on the bank while this was happening. What Parker described was an early loss of consciousness, an involuntary sliding away from awareness that came quickly in the sequence of events, leaving him without direct continuous memory of the interior period of the encounter. The word involuntary matters here. What Parker described was not a decision to stop perceiving, not a closing of the eyes, but something that arrived and removed him from the sequence against anything like his will. His memory of the exterior events on the bank was intact. His memory of the interior of the craft, of whatever followed on the other side of the craft's entry, was incomplete and fragmentary in a way that is itself a documented feature of the account. Inside the craft, what Hickson described was not pain. This is worth holding for a moment. The particular quality of his account of the interior, which was not characterized by physical suffering or by anything he described as an assault on his body, but by something stranger and more difficult to place. What he described was a device, large and resembling in his account a disembodied eye, an eye-like structure moving independently within the space of the craft, directing itself toward him and moving over and around him, with what appeared to be systematic purpose. The examination, if examination is the right word for it, was conducted by this device in a way that left Hickson conscious and observing and aware throughout. The device moved. It took its time. It did not acknowledge him as a person in any way he could identify. There was no communication, no exchange, nothing that functioned as address. The eye-like apparatus moved around a man who remained suspended and still in a paralysis he had not chosen, and it did what it appeared to be doing, and it gave him nothing in the way of explanation or recognition while it did it. The disorientation Hickson described was not primarily physical. It was the particular disorientation of being examined without reference, of being the subject of a process that proceeded with apparent purpose and offered him nothing in return, not pain, not cruelty. Something more impersonal than either, and in some ways more difficult to assign a category to. He described this aspect of the interior encounter in multiple retellings, and it remained a consistent element, the peculiar quality of an examination conducted without acknowledgement, by something that moved with intention and did not pause. Parker's account of the interior, assembled in part from hypnotic regression sessions conducted later by Dr. James Harder, was fragmentary in ways his exterior account was not. What he described inside the craft were impressions, rather than a clear continuous sequence, fragments of perception from a state that was not full waking consciousness and was not sleep in any ordinary sense. Among those fragments was an impression that has become one of the more discussed elements of the wider Pascagoula case. Parker described an entity he characterized as more feminine in appearance than the three figures that had appeared on the bank. This description, held privately by Parker for the better part of 4 decades before it entered the public record, was not offered in his original account to law enforcement on the night of October 11th, and was not shared in the public record until his 2018 account. The figure he described from the interior of the craft was distinct in his impression from the 3 exterior beings. What that distinction consisted of, and what it means within the broader architecture of the account, remains open in the way that many elements of the Pascagoula case remain open, documented, reported, and without a settled explanation. The sequence ended. The way Hickson described the conclusion of the encounter was a return to the bank, moved again in the floating, imposed way, set back on the concrete riverbank beside the Pascagoula River, the October night around him, the grain elevator standing dark behind him, the river moving south in the way it had been moving before any of this began. The craft was there for a moment above the water and above the bank, the blue-white light still steady, the low humming still present. Then it was not there. The departure, as both men described it, was swift enough that the question of how something of that size and that proximity had been there and then was not, became one of the things neither man had a satisfying way to answer. The light left the river. The bank was dark again. The hum was gone. Parker was on the bank. The ordinary quality of the October night had settled back over the riverbank in the way that the air, after anything unusual, seems to insist on its own neutrality. The water still moving, the grain elevator still standing, the flat coastal darkness still presenting itself as an unremarkable Gulf Coast evening on an unremarkable stretch of river. Neither man had been visibly hurt. Neither man had been transported to a different location. They were on the bank where they had been when the evening began, with their fishing lines presumably still in the water, and the October air around them, no different in temperature or humidity from the air that had been around them an hour before. What had changed was internal and private, and very difficult to describe to anyone who had not been on the bank. Parker sat near the water in the way a person sits when they are attempting to locate themselves in a situation that the normal categories are not equipped to handle. The river was beside him. The night was around him. The city of Pascagoula was somewhere behind the grain elevator and across the flat industrial waterfront, carrying on its ordinary business in the ordinary hours of an October evening, with no knowledge of what had just occurred on the west bank of the river that runs past its edge. Hickson was there. The two men were both on the bank, in the dark, trying to locate the edges of what had just happened to them against the ordinary persistence of the place they were still standing in. The craft had produced no damage to the bank, no scorched concrete, no displaced material, nothing that would mark the industrial surface of that stretch of the river in any way that a person arriving afterward could read as evidence of what had passed. The river moved south, as it moves south every night, indifferent to the particulars of what the men on its bank have or have not experienced. The current turned the water in the same direction it has always turned, carrying the surface of the river toward the Gulf 80 miles below, past the city and past the industrial waterfront, and past the place where the grain elevator stood dark and still and unchanged in the October night. What both men had described in the hours and decades that followed was an encounter with something for which neither the vocabulary of the period nor the broader vocabulary of their experience had prepared them. The shape of the object, the color of the light, the texture of the figures, the structure of those appendages, not hands, not fingers, built on a different model and reaching toward them in a light that was nobody's ordinary blue. The floating paralysis, the eye-like device moving with systematic purpose around a conscious man who could do nothing but observe it. The feminine impression in the fragmentary interior account that Parker held for 45 years before speaking of it. These were the elements. They were what both men described in consistent terms, each from the angle of his own experience, across the very different spans of time each man spent in the public record of the case. The accounts did not simplify over time. They did not drift toward the available cultural templates in the way that memory frequently does, borrowing the shape of a familiar story and gradually substituting it for the original. What Hickson described in 1973 and what Hickson described in later years carried the same specific, somewhat unusual details: the claw-like appendages, the eye-like device, the floating, the paralysis, the impersonal quality of the examination, without the kind of elaboration or regularizes that a fabricated account typically develops when a person has had years to refine and improve their story. The strangeness of the original account was still strange in the retelling. The details that made it unusual in 1973 were still unusual decades later, held in the same specific language, not rounded into anything more convenient. Parker's account held differently, because Parker largely did not give it in public during the years when Hickson was speaking. What Parker carried across 4 decades was held in a long private silence, a quietness that researchers noted and that stood in notable contrast to Hickson's sustained public engagement with the case. The difference between the two men's public postures toward their shared experience is itself a documented feature of the Pascagoula case, and what it indicates, whether about the nature of the experience or about the different psychologies of the two men, or about the differing weights that public attention placed on each of them, is not something the record settles definitively. What the record holds is that when Parker did speak in 2018, the account he gave was consistent in its core elements with the account given on the night it happened, and the details he added, including the feminine figure in the craft's interior, had the quality of things long held rather than things recently constructed. There is something particular about the bluish light as it fell across the concrete bank and the moving water of the Pascagoula River on the night of October 11th. Both men described it independently in the hours immediately following the event, before either had had much time to speak with the other about the vocabulary of what they had seen. The color landed in both accounts at the same point in the sequence, before the figures, before the paralysis, before any of the closer and stranger details that made the account of the Pascagoula encounter so specific. The light was the first thing that was visible after the sound. It fell on the bank and on the grain elevator behind them and on the dark southward moving surface of the river. And it was a color that did not belong to the ordinary palette of a Gulf Coast industrial evening. Both men noticed it. Both men described it the same way. The grain elevator stood behind them throughout. It was dark and still, and had been disused long enough to belong more to the landscape than to any active industrial purpose. It stood the way disused structures stand in flat terrain, simply present, a silhouette against whatever the sky was doing that night, offering nothing. The concrete bank at its base was the kind of surface you find wherever industrial infrastructure meets a working river, flat, functional, not designed with any particular human comfort in mind, but perfectly adequate for two men sitting with their lines in the water on a mild October evening. The lights of the city were far enough away to leave the immediate bank largely in shadow, which was one of the reasons the blue-white light was as visible and as strange as it was when it arrived. Hickson's description of being moved feet first through the opening in the craft carries a specific quality that is difficult to place against either the available fictional templates or the recorded experiences of ordinary life. It is not the way a person is usually described as being moved. The feet first detail appeared in his early accounts and remained there through the years of retelling, a particular, unglamorous, somewhat awkward specificity that does not serve any obvious narrative purpose and does not match the more dramatic framings of similar accounts from other cases of the era. It is simply what he said happened. He was moved feet first through an opening, in a state of physical paralysis, fully conscious, and what awaited him on the other side was the interior of something that did not explain itself to him at any point. The eye-like device has been discussed in the research literature as one of the most unusual interior elements of the Pascagoula account, not because scanning or examination devices appear nowhere else in reported encounter literature, but because of the specific way Hickson described it, large, disembodied, in the sense of being unattached to any visible mechanical housing, moving independently through the space of the craft with its own apparent direction and intention. He described watching it move. He was aware of it as a mobile presence in the space with him, and he described the examination it conducted as producing no pain, not gentle, because gentleness implies an acknowledgement that he was not given, but simply without the sensation of physical injury or distress. The absence of pain sits oddly alongside the paralysis and the involuntary transport, and the fact of being examined by something that gave him no information about itself or its purpose. Hickson noted this. The impersonality of the process was itself a distinctive quality of the experience, as he described it. Parker, regaining awareness on the bank, would have been in the first moments of trying to locate what had happened and what continued to happen in the surrounding air and the surrounding dark. The river was still there. The bank was still there. Hickson was there. The ordinary geometry of the riverbank had reasserted itself in the way that familiar places do, holding their configuration regardless of what has or has not passed through them. The water moved. The grain elevator stood. The distant lights of Pascagoula were where they had been before the blue-white light appeared across the industrial silhouette of the bank. Everything that had been in place at the beginning of the evening was still in place at whatever hour this was now, and the difficulty was not in locating the familiar things, but in understanding what their familiar presence meant against the weight of what had just occurred. The river moves past that bank the same way every night. It moves past the concrete, past the grain elevator's footprint, past the flat industrial edge where two men sat with their lines in the water on an October evening in 1973. It does not mark the occasion. It does not carry an impression of what passed over it in blue-white light and then departed. It carries the surface south toward the Gulf in the unhurried way it always has, and the bank stands in the same configuration it held before the light arrived, and the October night continues to be the kind of night it was before anything happened. Mild, humid, the air still, the sounds of the river and the distant city going on in their ordinary relationship to each other, without acknowledgement of what occurred at the edge of the water between them. Both men sat on that bank for some time before they moved. What they said to each other in those first minutes is not part of the documented record in any full or detailed sense. What is documented begins a little later, in the car on the way to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, and in the formal account given to Sheriff Fred Diamond, and in the covert tape recorded in the interview room. The bank at that immediate hour, the first minutes after the craft had gone and the light had left the river and the humming had stopped, belongs to the two men and to whatever they were doing in it, trying to sit in a familiar place and understand how the familiar place related to the thing that had just happened inside it. Parker was on the bank. The water was beside him, moving south. The night around both men was the same night it had been from the beginning. A mild, early autumn Gulf Coast evening, clear and calm, the air carrying the particular quality of October on the Mississippi coast before the season has committed to any real coolness. No rain had fallen. No strong wind had moved through. The conditions that both men had described before the encounter were the same conditions that surrounded them now, the October air and the October darkness, and the river running its 80 miles toward the Gulf, as it had done before. This began, and as it would do after, both men had driven away from the bank and gone to tell someone what they had seen. The grain elevator stood behind them, dark and still, the way it had stood at the start of the evening, before either man had reason to note it as anything other than background. The concrete bank was the same concrete bank it had been. The river was the same river. What was different was that two men who had come to the bank to fish on a quiet October night were now sitting with something that had no precedent in their experience and no ready place in the ordinary categories they had used to understand the world until approximately an hour ago. The stars were where they had been. The lights of the city were where they had been. The Pascagoula River was flowing south in its wide, unhurried way toward the Gulf of Mexico, past the industrial edge of a working city and into the open coastal water beyond it, carrying nothing on its surface that bore any trace of what had passed above it on this particular October evening. The two men sat a little longer in the dark. Then they got up, and they went to find someone to tell. On the night of October 11th, 1973, two men drove themselves to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office without stopping anywhere first. The decision itself is worth staying with for a moment. Not a phone call made from home, not a night spent deliberating, not a conversation with a family member before choosing how to proceed. They drove directly from the west bank of the Pascagoula River to the nearest law enforcement building and walked inside to report what they said had happened to them. The timing of that decision placed their raw state, whatever that state was, directly into an institutional record within hours of the reported event. Whatever they were carrying when they arrived, whatever showed in their faces and their hands and the way they spoke, was captured by that proximity, compressed into the same night, before sleep or distance or the passage of days could alter or settle it. Charles Hickson went in first, or went in more prepared, or at least managed to speak first, in something approaching organized language. The accounts of what the two men looked like when they arrived differ only in emphasis, not in their general impression. Hickson was described as shaken but communicative, a man working hard to find words adequate to something he had not been given words for in advance. Calvin Parker was described in terms that did not suggest performance. The officers who received them that night were dealing with two men who were not comfortable, who were not calm, and who were not by any witness account of the immediate scene in a condition that resembled the aftermath of a fabricated story being delivered to an audience. Fabrication takes a particular kind of steadiness. What the officers saw that night was not steady. Sheriff Fred Diamond was the receiving official. He heard what Hickson described, enough of it to understand that this was not a report. His office had a standard procedure for receiving, and he made a series of decisions about how to handle it. The first of those decisions was practical and direct. He took the report. He did not turn the men away, and he did not immediately contact another agency. He allowed the report to be made to him, and he began working through the institutional process of receiving it, which meant sitting with two men who were telling him something his experience as a law enforcement officer had not prepared him for, and finding a way to handle it professionally. Captain Glenn Ryder was also present in the early portion of the intake. Together, Diamond and Ryder established the basic facts as Hickson could articulate them: when, where, what the two men had been doing, in what sequence the events had reportedly occurred. The practical machinery of a law enforcement report being made about something no report form was designed to receive had a steadying effect of its own, the way procedural structure often does. It gave the conversation a shape it would otherwise have lacked. It gave Hickson something to walk through linearly, which is both easier than describing the formless and also for investigators more useful, because a linear account has edges where it can be checked against itself, places where the internal consistency can be examined, points where the story either holds or does not. At some point in the process, Diamond and Ryder made a second decision, one that went beyond standard intake procedure. They arranged to leave Hickson and Parker alone together in an interview room. This was a deliberate investigative choice, not an accident or an oversight. The room was not empty in the way the two men were meant to believe it was empty. A recording device was left running in the room while Diamond and Ryder stepped away, an arrangement designed to capture whatever the two men would say to each other when they believed they were no longer being observed or assessed. The thinking behind this kind of procedure is straightforward from an investigative standpoint. Two people who have coordinated a fabrication will behave differently when they believe the audience has left the room. They may laugh, they may compare notes on what they said and what they might need to adjust. They may drop the register of performance entirely and speak in a flatter, more ordinary way. The covert recording was designed to catch exactly that, the unguarded version, the private one, the one that would confirm or undermine what had been said in the official interview. The room, as the recording captured it, was quiet for a portion of the time. Then Hickson began to speak, not for the officers, not for a camera, not for any audience he knew was present. He spoke in the register of a man working something through in the presence of a colleague, someone he trusted to receive what he was saying without requiring him to justify it. What the recording captured was not the formal account. It was the residue of the formal account, the part that stayed after the structure of the interview had been removed, the part that had no audience to perform for. What Hickson said, in terms that have been quoted in the research literature across several decades, was that he wished the event had not happened to him. He said it in terms that carried the specific weight of something a person says when they mean it, not the theatrical protest of a man inviting disbelief, but the flatter, quieter statement of someone naming a difficulty they have not chosen and would not have chosen. He also said, in words variously rendered in different transcriptions and citations, that he knew what he had experienced was real, regardless of what anyone else believed or concluded. The specific quality of that statement, addressed to no one official, delivered without the careful framing of a man trying to be credible to skeptics, is part of what has kept it in the record. A man performing credibility shapes his words around the audience he is performing for. Hickson in that room was not performing for anyone. Calvin Parker was also audible on the recording. The sounds from Parker's side of the room were described by officers who later reviewed the tape and by researchers who encountered the transcripts as sounds of genuine distress, not the controlled emotion of a man who is prepared for how to seem distress, but the less organized quality of someone who has not yet found a way to contain what they are carrying, weeping or near it. The audible effort of someone trying to hold themselves together in the aftermath of something they had not recovered from. The people who have listened to that recording or read accounts of it have consistently noted that the spontaneous quality of Parker's distress was among the aspects of the evidence most difficult to attribute to theatrical staging. Sustained performance of that kind requires concentration. What was recorded did not sound like concentration. The tape itself, the physical object of it, a recording made in a Mississippi sheriff's office on an October night in 1973, has since been quoted, transcribed, referenced, and analyzed in an extensive body of research literature that spans 5 decades. Its content has been rendered in different ways by different writers and investigators, with minor variations in exact phrasing depending on source and era, but no version of its content has ever produced a transcript inconsistent with the general character of what has been described here. What the recording does not contain is a laugh. It does not contain a moment where either man steps out of the register of distress and into the register of ordinary conversation about a shared project. It does not contain a passage where Hickson indicates to Parker what they said and what they should remember to say the same way next time. The absence of those things is not conclusive proof of anything, but it is part of the record, and the record is what it is. Hickson was offered a polygraph examination during the period of the investigation. He agreed to undergo it. The examination was administered by an operator named Scott Glasgow, and the results, as reported at the time and widely circulated in media coverage of the case, were said to indicate no deception. This finding was among the most frequently cited elements of the early coverage and remained a reference point in discussions of the case across the following years. It is also the kind of finding that requires a careful approach. The polygraph is not a validated scientific instrument for the detection of deception, and its results cannot be taken as establishing, in any rigorous evidentiary sense, that a person is telling the truth. What polygraph results can establish, and what they establish in this case, is more limited than the coverage often implied. They can suggest that a person believed what they were saying. They can suggest that the physiological indicators associated with conscious deception were not present. They cannot reach behind belief to establish whether the belief corresponds to external reality. The Glasgow examination results say something about Hickson's state when he described his account. What that state corresponded to in the world outside the examination room is a question the polygraph was not built to answer. Calvin Parker did not submit to a polygraph examination during the same period, a fact that has been noted in the research literature without particular interpretive weight being assigned to it in either direction. Parker was 19 years old, in a state of visible acute distress, in a law enforcement office late at night, describing something that had no precedent in his experience or anyone else's in the room. The circumstances of his situation that night were not the circumstances of a person able to make calm and deliberate decisions about what formal procedures to participate in. The investigation at the Jackson County Sheriff's Office proceeded through the following days without the formal machinery of a criminal inquiry being applied to it in any sustained way. There was no charge of filing a false report brought against either Hickson or Parker. The absence of such a charge is in itself a limited fact. Law enforcement offices in 1973 did not routinely charge individuals with false reporting for UFO claims, regardless of their assessment of credibility. And the absence of charges does not constitute an official endorsement of the account's accuracy. What it does constitute is an official non-refutation. The machinery of the law chose not to formally designate what the two men had reported as a lie. Diamond, in statements reported from the period, was described as having concluded that the two men had genuinely experienced something that had terrified them. His reported conclusion was framed carefully, in the way institutional conclusions in ambiguous cases tend to be. He was not saying that what they described had happened, and he was not saying it had not happened. He was saying that the men had experienced something, and that whatever that something was, their fear of it was real. That particular formulation, the fear is real, the experience is real, the cause remains unknown, is one that the Pascagoula case returned to repeatedly across many different investigators in many different contexts. It is not a satisfying formulation. It does not close the case. It does not produce an explanation. It is the kind of conclusion that sits in a file and stays unresolved. And the Jackson County Sheriff's Office was the first institutional body to arrive at it within 24 hours of the reported event, on the basis of what two men looked and sounded like when they walked in off the street to describe something that had happened to them beside a river. The days that followed the initial report brought a different quality of attention to the case. News coverage began quickly. The story was unusual enough that it moved through regional and national outlets within a short time of the initial report being made public, and the coverage brought with it the particular pressure of external scrutiny applied to two men who had not sought it and who were not, in any obvious way, equipped for what it required of them. Hickson, as the older and more communicative of the two, became the primary face the press and subsequent investigators encountered. Parker withdrew from public contact almost entirely, a withdrawal that would last, in its essential character, for the better part of 45 years. The investigators who came after the initial law enforcement response were a different kind of presence. They brought credentials and frameworks that the sheriff's office had not possessed. They brought the tools of formal inquiry, of documented case methodology, of comparison with other reports in the accumulating literature of the phenomenon. Among them, the figure who arrived with the most formal scientific standing was someone whose prior involvement in the official study of this category of report was already extensive, a man who had spent years at the intersection of institutional science and the accumulated body of unexplained aerial and encounter cases, and who had developed, among other contributions, the classification language that gave the Pascagoula report the specific designation it would carry in the research literature. His arrival in Mississippi was the case's first clear point of contact with the longer institutional history of this kind of investigation, and his assessment of the two men he spoke with was, in its careful and considered way, consequential. What the investigative record from that period shows across the several researchers and analysts who engaged with the case in its early months is a consistent pattern. No one who sat with Hickson and Parker and assessed them directly, as opposed to assessing them from a distance, through a skeptical interpretive framework applied to the account rather than the men, produced a conclusion that characterized their account as the product of deliberate deception. This does not mean no investigator was skeptical. Several were, and their skepticism is a legitimate part of the record. The distinction is between skepticism about what the account describes and a conclusion that the men were knowingly fabricating a story they did not believe. The former is intellectually reasonable and scientifically defensible. The latter, based on what the investigation actually produced in terms of evidence and behavioral assessment, was not the conclusion that the direct engagement with Hickson and Parker generated. The covert tape remained in the record through all of this. It was not, in the initial coverage or in the investigations that followed it, the primary subject. It was one element among several. The polygraph results, the behavioral assessments, the consistency of the account across retellings, the absence of a credible motive for fabrication, the documented state of both men on the night of the report. But the tape had a particular quality that made it return persistently in any honest account of what the investigation produced. It was unguarded. It was captured without the men's knowledge, which meant it was not shaped by any desire to convince. It was Hickson speaking to Parker about something they had both been through in a room they believed was private, saying the things a person says when the audience has gone. The fact of its existence, a small cassette or reel recorded in a Mississippi County office in the autumn of 1973, filed somewhere in the records of an investigation that never formally concluded, is part of what the Pascagoula case actually is, as distinct from the popular version of it, or the most dramatic version of it. The popular version tends toward the encounter itself, toward the reported entities and the craft and the examination, toward the event by the river. The evidentiary version includes those reported details, but it also includes this room, this tape, this quiet and unobserved conversation between two men who were not performing for anyone, in which neither man laughed, neither man contradicted his own account, and both men sounded, in the assessment of everyone who has heard or read the recording, exactly like people who had been through something they could not explain and could not escape. The investigation at the institutional level did not arrive at a conclusion that closed the case in either direction. No explanation was offered for what Hickson and Parker described. No charge of deception was filed. No official body endorsed the account as a record of a physical encounter with an unidentified craft and its occupants. The case was left where so many cases of this kind are left, in the particular condition of being documented, investigated, and unresolved, held in institutional memory without being formally retired. Diamond's reported assessment that the two men had genuinely experienced something that terrified them stands as the nearest thing the official record produced to a conclusion. It is not, by the standards of scientific or legal resolution, a conclusion at all. It is the acknowledgement that something happened, that the something was real in its effect, and that what the something was cannot be established from the evidence available. There is a specific quality to that kind of institutional non-conclusion that is worth holding for a moment. It is not the same as having investigated a case and found nothing to investigate. It is not the dismissal of a report as without foundation, or the closure of a file as having been satisfactorily explained. It is the quieter outcome, the one where the investigation was conducted with appropriate seriousness, where the witnesses were assessed as credible and non-deceptive, where the physical circumstances were examined, and where the final position of the record is simply that the event does not have an explanation. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office was not a body that dealt in that kind of outcome regularly. The Pascagoula case gave them one, and it stayed that way. What the tape preserves, beyond any interpretive frame applied to it, is the quality of two men in an institutional room late at night, carrying something that had not yet fully resolved itself into language, speaking to each other without the pressure of being witnessed. Hickson's voice on that recording, the voice of a 42-year-old foreman in a Mississippi shipyard, a man whose working life had been built on practical competence and earned trust, saying into an empty room that he wished this had not happened to him, carries a weight that is not easily attributed to performance, not because it is impossible to perform that kind of thing, but because the specific context of the recording, the unobserved room, the absence of any audience to perform for, the presence of Parker's audible distress from the other side of the room, makes the performance hypothesis something that has to be actively maintained against the texture of what was actually recorded. The tape does not prove what happened on the riverbank. Nothing in the investigative record proves what happened on the riverbank. That is the condition the case is in, 50 years after it was filed, and the honest acknowledgement of that condition is the only intellectually defensible place to stand in relation to it. But the tape does establish something about the two men in that room, about their state, about the unperformed quality of their distress, about the specific texture of what was captured when the institutional machinery left them alone and let the recording run. It is a small and specific piece of documentary evidence made in an ordinary room in an ordinary building in the autumn of 1973, and it has sat in the record without adequate explanation across every decade since. The investigation eventually passed out of the immediate attention of the sheriff's office and into the longer and slower attention of the research literature. The case did not close. It moved from the jurisdiction of law enforcement into something wider, a broader body of accumulated accounts and analyses and arguments about the nature of the phenomenon, into which it was absorbed as one of the most carefully documented and least easily dismissed cases in the record. The tape went with it, quoted and requoted, a small rectangle of recorded sound from a Mississippi night in October, still carrying the voice of a man who said he wished it had never happened to him, and who never, in any of the years that followed, said anything different. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office eventually archived the materials from the case in the manner of any investigation that does not arrive at formal charges or a resolved conclusion. The file did not close in the sense of being settled. It was placed in the condition that unresolved cases are placed in, documented, accessible to researchers who sought it, part of the official record in the specific and limited sense that the initial report had been received, and the subsequent investigation had been conducted. No finding of fabrication, no finding of confirmed physical event. The record exists in the condition it was made in, received, noted, investigated, and left open, the way certain questions are left open when the evidence is honest about what it cannot establish. The tape remains. That is the simplest and most accurate thing to say about it. It was recorded in 1973, and it has survived into the record of the case, and it contains what it contains, and what it contains has not been satisfactorily accounted for by any explanation that dismisses what the two men reported. It is not a conclusion, it is not proof. It is a document, a small, specific, unguarded piece of documentation from an institutional room in Mississippi on a night in October when no one was meant to be listening, and the recording ran anyway. And what it captured was what it captured, and the case around it stayed open, and the river kept moving south, past the West Bank, and the dark shape of the grain elevator, and the flat industrial shore where two men had been sitting with their lines in the water, and continued on toward the Gulf of Mexico, carrying whatever it carries, and has not stopped since. Dr. J. Allen Hynek arrived in Pascagoula on a Gulf Coast autumn day, carrying a notepad and the particular patience of a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades sitting across from people trying to describe things they did not have adequate language for. He was a Northwestern University astronomer. He had served as the scientific consultant to the United States Air Force's Project Blue Book, the official government investigation into reported aerial phenomena that had run from 1952 to 1969. He had designed the classification framework that organized reported encounters into categories, the language of close encounters that would outlast almost everything else connected to his name. When he came to Pascagoula in October 1973, he came not as a believer and not as a debunker, but as someone who had learned over many years of looking at these cases that the interesting ones tended to resist both postures equally. The meeting he arranged was a practical and physical thing. He sat across from Charles Hickson in a room in Pascagoula, Mississippi, and listened. Hickson was 42 years old, a shipyard foreman with calloused hands and a straightforward manner, and he spoke about what had happened on the riverbank with the same measured effort he had used when speaking to the sheriff's office 6 days earlier. Hynek listened. He asked questions. He watched the way Hickson answered them, not performing, not reconstructing the account for a new audience, but describing, with the specific fatigue of a man who had already told the story several times to people who were trying to determine whether he was telling the truth. Hynek's assessment, delivered in the days following the interview, was that Hickson and Parker were credible witnesses whose account warranted serious investigative attention. That assessment was reported in national media coverage of the case. It entered the record, and it remained there, attached to the case, for the next 50 years. Hynek had covered a great deal of ground before arriving at that conclusion. The classification system he had developed while working with Project Blue Book organized reported encounters by proximity and character, close encounters of the first, second, and third kind, a framework that distinguished sightings at a distance from cases involving physical trace evidence and cases involving reported contact with occupants. The Pascagoula incident, with its reported entities and described examination aboard a craft, fell into the third category. It was not the first case of that kind in the record, and it was not the last, but it arrived with a quality of specific, consistent, and physiologically observable distress that placed it, in Hynek's assessment, above the threshold of cases that could be satisfactorily attributed to misidentification or fabrication. The astronomer who had spent 2 decades reading these files recognized something in it that he was not able to dismiss. The autumn of 1973 produced more than one case that resisted the usual mechanisms of dismissal. The Pascagoula report arrived during what researchers would later describe as the 1973 UFO flap, one of the largest single-year clusters of reported encounters in the post-World War II era, a concentrated wave of reported aerial and close proximity incidents that generated a volume of documentation across multiple states and multiple categories of witness. The cases from that autumn accumulated in the files, in the newspapers, in the investigative archives of civilian research organizations at a rate that distinguished the period from surrounding years. Researchers who worked through the wave would note, in later assessments, that the sheer density of the 1973 reports made individual cases harder to isolate, but also harder to explain away as isolated products of local suggestion or media-driven reporting. 1 week after the Pascagoula River bank, on the night of October 18, 1973, a United States Army Reserve crew was flying a military helicopter near Mansfield, Ohio. The pilot was Captain Lawrence Coyne, an experienced military aviator. He had 3 crew members with him. What the crew reported encountering that night entered the record as one of the most thoroughly documented aerial cases of the 1973 wave, a case with the particular evidentiary quality of 4 trained military observers aboard a functioning aircraft, with instruments and with ground-level witnesses positioned below the flight path, who corroborated from the surface what the crew reported from the air. The crew described an unidentified object that appeared to affect the helicopter's controls and altitude in ways that the mechanical settings, as Coyne later documented, could not account for. The altimeter read something the instruments were not set to produce. The object pulled away into the dark above them. 4 experienced crew members filed consistent accounts. Ground witnesses reported seeing something in the same area of sky at the same time. The case entered the record 7 days after the Pascagoula River bank, in the same autumn, in the same cluster of documented reports, and it remained, as the Pascagoula case remained, in a state of unresolved official status. The weight of a single case is different when it sits alongside other cases from the same period. The 1973 wave did not explain Pascagoula. Nothing in the volume of concurrent reports accounted for what Hickson and Parker described on the west bank of the river that October, but the wave placed the Pascagoula report inside a broader pattern of documentation, a pattern that the researchers who worked through the files would return to repeatedly in the decades that followed, noting that the density and geographic spread of the 1973 reports constituted a record that resisted reduction to any single explanation. The cases did not prove each other. They simply existed in the same year, in the same archive, waiting with the particular patience of documented things for an explanation that had not yet arrived. Charles Hickson carried the case for 38 years. He gave interviews. He made public appearances. He co-authored a book in 1983 with the journalist William Mendez, the text of it covering the events on the river and the years that followed. Hickson's name on the spine, above the year that had divided his life in 2. He was asked, across those 38 years, whether he had changed his account, whether he had revised the core elements of what he described in the sheriff's office on the night of October 11, 1973. The researchers who tracked the case documented his answer across multiple decades. He had not. The claw-like appendages were still described the same way. The bluish light was still the same light. The eye-like device inside the craft was still the device that had moved around him while he was suspended there, fully conscious and unable to move. The core account did not shift. It persisted across 38 years of questioning with a consistency that those who reviewed the case across multiple decades consistently noted as one of its least easily dismissible features. Hickson died on September 9, 2011, at the age of 80. He had not retracted his account. He had not, in the years approaching his death, expressed doubt about what he had experienced on the riverbank in 1973. The core of the account, The light, the craft, the beings, the examination, the return to the bank remained intact, filed in the record, attached to his name in the case files and research literature and documentary treatments of the Pascagoula incident that continued to be produced after his death. He had been 42 years old on the night it happened, a foreman with a particular kind of earned practical authority, and he had spent the remaining 38 years of his life describing it to anyone who asked with the same patient, measured effort he had used on the first night in the sheriff's office when it was still new and the words for it were still the hardest part. Some accounts take a long time to come fully into the open. Calvin Parker, 19 years old, on the night of October 11, 1973, maintained near total public silence about the case for the better part of 4 decades. He did not disappear. His name remained attached to the case in the literature and the media coverage, but the specific interior dimensions of what he had experienced, the fragmentary impressions from the hypnotic regression sessions conducted by Dr. James Harder, the figure he described as more feminine in appearance than the 3 beings on the riverbank, the details he had held back from the formal accounts given in 1973, and the years immediately following, those remained with him private for decades that accumulated into nearly half a century. In 2018, Parker published his own account. The book was called Pascagoula, The Closest Encounter, and it was co-written with the researcher Irina Scott. Parker was 64 years old when it was published. He had been silent for 45 years when it was published. He had been silent for 45 years, carrying the account through a life that had continued in the ordinary ways that lives do. The years of work, the years of change, the steady accumulation of time between the man he had been on the riverbank and the man who sat across from Irina Scott and put the remaining details into words. The book disclosed things he had not disclosed publicly before. The feminine entity was one of them. His account of the interior of the craft, the impressions recovered in regression and held privately for 45 years, was another. The core details, when measured against Hickson's public account and the original statements filed with the sheriff's office in 1973, remained consistent. They had simply been waiting inside one man's private memory for nearly half a century before finding the words and the page. The case file of the Pascagoula incident is a document with volume. It is documented in Jerome Clark's comprehensive reference work, the UFO Encyclopedia, which organizes the major cases of the post-war era with the particular care of a researcher who has spent decades reading the primary sources and distinguishing what is established from what is claimed. The Pascagoula entry in that archive sits alongside other cases from 1973 and from the decades before and after, cases organized by category, by geography, by the quality of the available evidence, by the consistency or inconsistency of the witness accounts. It has been partially transcribed in research literature. Portions of the covert recording made at the Jackson County Sheriff's Office on the night of October 11th have been quoted in books and articles across 5 decades. The case has generated documentary treatments. It has attracted the attention of researchers from multiple countries and multiple investigative traditions, and it has remained, across all of that accumulated attention, in the same unresolved condition it occupied on the morning of October 12, 1973, when the 2 men went home from the sheriff's office, and the question of what had happened on the riverbank was already older than one night. There is a historical marker near the west bank of the Pascagoula River. The city erected it to acknowledge the 1973 incident as a historically notable event, an event that brought international attention to Pascagoula and that took its place in the documented record of the place and the year. The marker stands near the location of the reported encounter. Its text is fixed in metal. The river is visible behind it, moving in the direction it has always moved, southward toward the Gulf, the same direction it was moving on the night of October 11th, 1973, when two men stood on the industrial concrete bank a short distance away and cast their lines into the current. A visitor to the site can stand near the marker and look at the water. The grain elevator structure that stood dark and still behind the two men on that October night has changed in the decades since, the waterfront reshaped by the years and by the industrial rhythms of a working port city. But the river has not changed. The river moves at the same pace it moved when Hickson and Parker were sitting on the bank, before the light appeared, before anything had interrupted the ordinary quiet of a mild autumn evening on the Gulf Coast. The Pascagoula River has its own documented peculiarity. It has been noted for a long time in local accounts, in the observations of people who have spent time along its banks and on its water, that the river sometimes produces a sound, a humming, a singing quality that comes from the water itself, or from what moves through the water, or from some combination of the riverbed and the current and the particular acoustic conditions of the flat coastal terrain through which the Pascagoula flows. The sound is documented. It was noted long before 1973, and it has been noted in the years since by people with no connection to the events of October 11th, and by people who knew the case well and came to the river specifically to listen for it. Choctaw oral tradition, rooted in the land and the waterways of the region for generations before the city of Pascagoula existed, held that the sound came from the spirits of a people who had chosen to walk into the river rather than submit to conquest, a tradition that placed the humming inside a history of loss and endurance, giving the river's sound a meaning that preceded any scientific inquiry into its source. The scientific explanations for the river's humming have not settled into agreement. Hypotheses have been proposed: riverbed gas release, specific fish species whose behavior produces acoustic vibrations in the water, atmospheric acoustic conditions particular to the region and the season. None of these has achieved the status of a definitive explanation. The sound continues to be reported by people who have heard it, and the proposed mechanisms for it continue to be weighed against each other in the literature without producing a resolution. The river sings, or hums, or produces a sound that witnesses consistently describe in similar terms, and the origin of that sound remains, like the events of October 11th, 1973, in a state of documented openness, something recorded, something real, in the sense that multiple independent observers have reported it, and something for which no satisfactory account has been formally established. There is a particular quality to cases that persist across 5 decades without resolving. The Pascagoula incident has that quality. It is not the quality of a case that is growing. The file does not expand the way it once did. The wave of media coverage and investigative attention that defined the early 1970s long since receded. It is the quality of a case that simply continues to exist in the same condition it has occupied since the morning after the night it was reported, documented, unresolved, returned to periodically by researchers and journalists and documentary makers who find in it the same combination of witness, credibility, evidentiary specificity, and interpretive openness that made it notable in 1973. The file sits in the archive. The case appears in the reference works. Parker's 2018 book, sits on shelves where researchers have placed it alongside the earlier literature, adding its 45 years of held private detail to the record that was begun on the night two men drove to the sheriff's office and said what they had seen. The investigators who have worked through the Pascagoula case across the decades have arrived at a range of positions on it, and none of those positions has achieved the status of a settled conclusion. Some researchers have argued that the consistency of the account across multiple decades of independent retelling, the physiological distress observed at the sheriff's office, the covert recording that captured neither laughter nor contradiction nor any behavioral signal of coordinated deception, and the polygraph results reported by Scott Glasgow all point toward an experience that was genuinely undergone, something real that happened to two men on a riverbank. Whatever its ultimate nature, other researchers have offered frameworks involving misperception, psychological response to stress, sleep-related phenomena, or the distorting effect of cultural context on anomalous experiences. The research literature holds all of these positions. None of them has been established as the account that the case reduces to. The question that was opened on the night of October 11th, 1973, remains open in the same way it has always been open, not through institutional failure, not through concealment, not through any absence of effort or intelligence on the part of the people who have worked through the evidence, but simply because the evidence, honestly followed, leads to the edge of what is established and stops there. Hynek died in 1986. He had spent the years between his Pascagoula visit and his death continuing the work he had begun before it, gathering cases, organizing the record, advocating for the scientific treatment of reported phenomena that official frameworks had been too narrow to contain. The close encounter classification system he had designed remained in use after his death, a practical framework built from decades of reading witness accounts and finding in them enough consistency to organize, enough variation to challenge, and enough unresolved specificity to keep the inquiry alive. His visit to Pascagoula had been one stop among many, but it had been a consequential one, in the sense that his presence lent the case a degree of scientific attention that it might not otherwise have received, and his assessment of Hickson and Parker as credible witnesses became part of the case's documented record in a way that persisted through his death and through the subsequent decades of investigation. The river does not stop moving on account of what happened on its west bank in October 1973. It has continued south through 50 years of Gulf Coast autumns, carrying the flat, dark water past the industrial waterfront of Pascagoula, past the grain elevator site on Salpeter Road, past the concrete bank where two men sat with their fishing lines in the quiet hours of an October night. The Pascagoula runs approximately 80 miles from the confluence of the Leaf and Chickasaw rivers near Merrill, Mississippi, to the Gulf of Mexico, draining a basin of roughly 9,000 square miles. It is one of the largest unimpounded river systems in the contiguous United States. It has been running south since before anyone wrote anything down about it, and it has continued running south through every year that Hickson gave interviews, and every year that Parker was silent, and every year since the historical marker was placed near the bank, and every year since Hynek arrived with his notepad and his questions and his particular patient attention. The quality of the Pascagoula case that has kept it in the research literature across 5 decades is not its drama. The events described by Hickson and Parker were not violent. They were not physically injurious in any documented sense. They were strange, precisely and specifically strange, in the way that genuine anomalies tend to be strange, rather than the way theatrical inventions tend to be strange. The claw-like appendages were a detail specific enough to distinguish the account from the generic alien imagery of the era. The eye-like scanning device was an interior detail that Hickson described with the specific halting effort of a man working to convey something for which he had no ready vocabulary. Parker's near total silence for 45 years, and the consistency of what he eventually disclosed with what Hickson had been saying publicly for decades, produced a pattern that researchers noted as carrying a particular kind of evidential weight, not proof, not certainty, but the quality of two separate private experiences, held separately across half a century, arriving at the same place when finally compared. The case has been covered in books and documentaries and research journals and popular articles and podcasts and online forums, and it will be covered again. The interest in it does not seem to diminish in proportion to the time elapsed. If anything, the addition of Parker's 2018 account, with its 45 years of private detail finally disclosed, has generated renewed attention from researchers who had worked with the original record and found in the new disclosures a consistency they had not expected and could not easily dismiss. The case generates the same quality of careful attention from the people who take the time to read through the full evidentiary record that it generated from Hynek in the autumn of 1973. Something in the account resists the mechanisms that comparable cases tend to yield to over time under sustained investigative pressure. The resistance is itself a feature of the record. It has not been explained. It continues. Outside the specific facts of the Pascagoula case, the 1973 wave produced a year-long record that remains one of the densest single-year concentrations of documented reports in the post-war archive. The Coyne helicopter case from Mansfield, Ohio, the Pascagoula River bank, dozens of other reports filed that autumn from multiple states and multiple categories of witness, ground observers, military personnel, law enforcement, civilians in rural and suburban and industrial settings. The pattern of the 1973 wave does not resolve into a single explanation any more than the individual cases within it resolve. It simply remains in the archive as the record of a particular year, waiting with the same patience that all documented things wait with for an accounting that has not arrived in the 50 years since the filing began. The historical marker near the Pascagoula River bank is a simple thing: metal text fixed on a post positioned near the west bank of the river, acknowledging in plain civic language that something happened here in October 1973 that brought the eyes of the world, briefly, to this stretch of industrial waterfront on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi. It is an unusual thing for a municipality to do. Most places do not erect markers at the sites of unexplained events. Pascagoula did. The marker stands. The river moves past it, slightly east of the text and the post, carrying the southern current toward the Gulf in the same unhurried way it has always carried it. People come to stand near the marker sometimes, researchers, curious visitors, people who have read the case file and want to stand in the physical location where the account begins. They look at the water. They look at the flat industrial landscape of the West Bank, the concrete and the distance and the low horizon of a Gulf Coast waterfront. They hear, on some evenings, if the conditions are right, a sound that comes from the water that is not quite wind and not quite current, the particular humming that the river is documented to produce, whose source has not been definitively identified, whose sound continues regardless of whether anyone is there to hear it. The world of October 11th, 1973 is 50 years behind the present. Charles Hickson is gone.